So you kind of got to weigh the pros and cons there. If you're going for storage, you might want to grow these as your sweet onion as opposed to the flattened ones. What's up, Lazy Dog fam? Hope all y'all are having an outstanding day. It is Tuesday, May 2nd here in South Georgia, and it's finally time to call it a season on most of these onions here behind me. So we're going to talk about how you know when the onions are ready to harvest. We're going to talk about how to cure and store onions, and then we're going to kind of give an assessment of these 5 different varieties that we grew over this past winter. So we've got 5 double rows of 5 different short day onion varieties that we transplanted back in November. You can see the weeds are starting to get the best of us a little bit as we've been busy working in some of our other garden plots. It's finally time to get most of these onions out of here, start getting this cleaned up so we can plant some watermelons. So first, let's talk about how we know when onions are ready to harvest. And I'll give you 3 different signs of how you can tell. So sign number 1, they start falling over like you see with those right there. We got 3 or 4 that's fallen over in that double row and several over there that have fallen over too. Now sign number 2 isn't quite as obvious as sign number 1, but it's pretty easy to tell when it's happening. So you can see in this row, this one here has fallen over. This one here hasn't fallen over. We can see how the leaves are starting to die back some. And if we feel of the stem down here at the bottom, we can feel it's kind of weak. So for whatever reason, it hasn't fallen over. When the leaves start dying back like this, it's pretty much ready to harvest. And then the 3rd sign, which I can't really show you because none of my onions are doing it, would be if the onions start flowering. Now, flowering is something we don't want to happen because it usually means the onion won't store very long, but sometimes it does happen. So if your onions start flowering, it's best to go ahead and pull them, eat them as soon as possible. They're usually not going to store very long. Now these red onions in this double row, the Chianti variety, they still look like they've got a ways to go. They're not really showing any of those signs we just talked about, but we're seeing at least 1 or 2 of those signs in these other 4 double rows. Now, if you've got plenty of time, you've got plenty of garden space, and you're not needing to get your onions out so you can plant something else, like I am, you can wait until each individual plant falls over or the leaves start dying back. In my case, I need to get these onions out of here. I need to get these cleaned up so we can plant some watermelons. So I'm gonna go ahead and harvest all these, even though a few of the plants along the row are still standing. So I'm gonna go ahead and pull 4 of these double rows. We'll leave the red onions for the time being. I'll pull them, lay them out on the grass. We'll have each variety separated. Then we can talk about how we cure and dry the onions. All right, so we got 4 of those double rows pulled there, left the red onions for the time being. And yes, that is a heap of onions, but I love growing onions, and so I always just plant a bunch of them just because it's fun. All right, so after you've pulled your onions, what you want to do is lay them out single file. You don't want to stack them all on top of one another. They won't dry that great that way. So lay them out in a row like we have there. You can do this on the grass, or you can do it right in the plot. There's many years where I'll just pull the onions and flip them up, lay them right on the dirt there. I need to get this cleaned up for some watermelons, so that's why I'm laying mine on the grass. If you are going to lay them on the grass like this, make sure your grass is cut. Don't lay them in some real thick grass because you'll get a lot of moisture from dew and stuff like that. So I cut my grass yesterday knowing that I was going to do this today. So lay the onions out in full sun like we have here. That's what you want. And pick a window of a few days when you're not going to have any rain. I was going to do this late last week, but then I got looking at the forecast and it said we were going to get a bunch of rain this past weekend, which we did. And so I waited until today because it looks like we're not getting any rain for the next 4 or 5 days. Now, if your onions are ready to pull and the rain is just relentless, you can do this, like for instance, underneath my barn over there. It will just take a lot longer for them to dry and cure that way. I have cured them underneath the barn. Ideally though, this is the way I like to do it. Now, how long you leave them out here will vary a little bit, just depending on how mature your onions are. Some of these that have already fallen over might dry out a little quicker than some of these that hadn't fallen over. But what we're waiting to see here is we want to see these root ends here get nice and crispy, almost to the point where you can just pull them off the bottom of the onion there. And we want these tops to dry up and get brown. So we don't want to see any green on these tops, and we want to see nice crispy roots there. And hopefully in the next few days, once these onions dry and cure out here in the sun on the grass, I can show you what they're supposed to look like before we put them in storage. So stay tuned for that. We'll try to throw that in on another video later this week. So now let's do a little variety comparison here, because two of these varieties we grew last year, two of these we've never grown before. So up top there we've got the DP Sweet, and then in that second row we've got the Timon onion. Grew both of those last year. Down here we've got the Georgia Boy, those are those flat yellow ones there, and then we've got this white onion called White Phantom. So first year growing Georgia Boy or White Phantom. So all of these varieties, including the red Chianti onion that we haven't pulled yet, are bred by a company called DP Seeds, and I believe that stands for Dependable Proven Seeds. So to the best of my understanding, DP Seeds is a breeder, so they develop varieties and grow out seed crops and then wholesale those seeds to online seed retailers who put them in smaller packages and sell them to folks like me and you. Now DP Seeds has a company, from what I understand, called NE Seeds online. I think it's neseeds.com. That's where we get our seeds from. So we're not buying these wholesale, we're buying them online from NE Seeds. And I don't have any kind of affiliate relationship with this company. I don't get paid to mention this company. I just know they have some really good onion seeds. The owner did send me an email last year and say, hey, I appreciate you spreading the word about our seeds, but that's the extent of our relationship. Now, I've never grown anything but their short day varieties, so I can't speak on their intermediate day or long day offerings, but I would presume those are pretty good as well. So let's start by looking at this DP Sweet variety, which grew these absolute monsters you see here. Now, in the onion game, they have different words to classify different sizes of onions. You've got medium onions, you've got large onions, you've got jumbo onions, then you've got colossal onions, and then I'm creating my own category for these. These are what we call monster onions. Now this variety, I believe, is classified as a Granix type onion, which means it's somewhat flattened. Now it's not as flattened as the Georgia Boy variety, I'll show you in a minute, but you can see it's not round, it's kind of flattened there. And so this variety performed really well for us last year, performed even better for us this year. I think it had a lot to do with all the chicken manure we had on that plot there. So if you feed these things well, you'll make some monster onions. Now, if there was one downside to this DP Sweet variety, it would be that a small percentage of them will split, like we see right here. Now, sometimes this happens because I don't thin my onions real well when I'm pulling them out of the seed trays, and I accidentally plant two onion plants in one spot. So sometimes that's my fault. Sometimes some varieties do it more than others. I would say about 4 or 5% of my onions look like this right here. Now we can still eat these. They probably won't store very well and they look kind of gnarly. So just expect that with some varieties. The DP Sweet variety does seem to give you a few more splits than some other varieties. So the next variety we have here is called Timon, just like the character on the Lion King. And this is a round sweet onion. So you can see this one is shaped a lot different than the DP Sweet onion I showed you just a minute ago. These don't get quite as big as the DP Sweet onions do, but we did pretty good with these this year. We did good with them last year, but having even more fertility in the soil gave us even bigger onions this year. These three right here are a little bit bigger than a softball, so some nice round sweet onions. Now the next variety we have here is Georgia Boy, our first year growing this variety. Now we planted these a couple weeks later than the Timon and DP Sweet varieties. They weren't near as big when that Arctic blast hit right before Christmas. I didn't think these were going to come back, but they did. So that's why these are a little smaller than those others. Had they been planted at the same time, they'd probably be closer to the size that we've got on those DP Sweets. So this is what I would call a true Granix style onion. You can see how flat those onions are. This is what most people would refer to as a Vidalia onion. Nice flat sweet onion there. And considering what we dealt with planting these late, the Arctic blast killing back the plants to the ground, I think we did pretty good with this variety, and I think this variety is definitely a keeper. And then lastly, we've got our white onions here, this variety called White Phantom. First year trying this variety. It actually been a few years since I grew any white onions, so I was kind of glad to add them back to the rotation. These were planted late, kind of like the Georgia boys, so we dealt with some struggles with these early on, but we ended up making some pretty decent sized white onions. Now, from my experiences, white onions will never get as big as some of those Granix type yellow onions, but that one there is about softball size. These other two are kind of between a baseball and a softball, so I'm not mad about the results on these, and I think this variety is a keeper as well. So really nothing to complain about with any of those varieties. I mean, if we wanted to get nitpicky, we could complain about the splitting on the DP Sweets a little bit, but there just wasn't enough splits for me to worry about. I think the size of those onions outweighs the few that split. So now let's talk about something that I think is very important to know when you're choosing the onion varieties you're going to grow, and that is storage potential. So not all these onions will store for the same amount of time. Some don't have a very long storage potential, some have a pretty decent storage potential. So I just went and pulled one of these red Chianti onions because we'll start there. So it has been my experiences over the years that red onions have the shortest shelf life. You want to use these first. We'll be pickling a lot of ours. That's a great way to preserve onions, but I usually don't get more than a couple months storage out of these. So we try to use these or preserve these first because they usually don't last very long, even if we dry them and cure them properly like we'll be doing. So next on the shelf life scale would be our yellow, sweet, Granix, or flattened type onions. You can see here the differences between the DP Sweet and the Georgia Boy onion. The Georgia Boy is a lot more flattened than the DP Sweet is. So these onions will store a little longer than the red onions will, but they don't have a particularly long shelf life. You want to use these within a few months of harvest. Now, from my experiences, the flatter the onion is, the sweeter it's probably going to be, but also the shorter the shelf life is going to be. So DP Sweet will probably store a little longer than this one here, this Georgia Boy, which is really flattened. And then next on the list we have our yellow round sweet onions. So these are going to store longer than the red onions, and they're going to store a little longer than those flattened sweet onions. I can usually get about 3 months, maybe a little more storage out of these before they start going bad under the barn. Now these won't be quite as sweet as those flattened onions that I showed you earlier, but they do store longer. So you kind of got to weigh the pros and cons there. If you're going for storage, you might want to grow these as your sweet onion as opposed to the flattened ones. And then we have the white onions. So of all the onions we grew this year, these will store the longest. Now obviously white onions aren't very sweet. They have a really strong pungent onion flavor. I like that onion flavor in some dishes, and that's why we grew white onions. So if you're going for sweetness, you're probably not going to get long storage, but if you want that strong onion flavor, you're going to get some good storage out of these. So those are just my experiences with comparing onion storage. Your experiences may be different, and if they are, please do share them in the comments below. I have an okay onion storage system underneath the barn there. It's not perfect, but I don't have anywhere inside my house to put this many onions, so that's why we put them underneath the barn. Yes, they would probably store longer if we had some kind of indoor storage system, but we're doing the best we can. So you may find varieties of red onions that store much longer than my red onions, or sweet onions that store much longer. This can also vary depending on whether it's an intermediate day or long day type. I'm just telling you what I have seen with these short day onions. So now we've got those onions pulled, we can start getting this part ready to plant some watermelons in the next couple weeks. Gonna have to pull up that drip tape, probably wheel hoe this area, rake a lot of those weeds out of there, and probably wheel hoe it several times to really work on our weed seed bank and get this nice and manageable again. We don't want a bunch of weed pressure in here when we're growing watermelons. We've still got some cabbage over here, some broccoli over here. This cabbage is already heading up, so it won't be here much longer. The broccoli hasn't started forming heads yet, but it won't be long, especially with it warming up the way it has been. So I hope you enjoyed the video today. Be sure to check out our affiliate links in the description below and go check out our website, lazydogfarm.com. And I promise I don't have any secrets that I haven't told you about as far as growing big onions. Just watch this video right here. We've got 10 easy to follow tips, and if you follow those tips, you'll be able to grow some big onions as well. So check that out, and we'll see you next time right here at Lazy Dog Farm.